One last argument for the existence of God that we're going to look at is Pascal's wager. It's a very famous argument to the conclusion that we ought to believe that God exists, but it's so different than everything that we've looked at so far. To quickly recap, what we've been looking at are arguments that try to convince us that God exists, and so we see the ontological argument, and it tells us that if we can really grasp the concept of God, we'll see that God has to exist in this world. And we saw some problems with that and a different version of it that's a little bit more promising. The cosmological argument said when you look at the universe and realize that it's a contingent thing, it needs an explanation. We need an explanation on why it exists rather than nothing at all. And this is where we bring God in, and we saw some variations on that. The argument from design, or the fine-tuning argument, and then the moral argument. All of these arguments asked us to look at certain facts, our knowledge of moral obligations, the fine-tuning of the universe towards the production of human life, or the idea that the universe itself looks like it's a very precise machine, the potential contingency of the universe, the concept of God. Look at all these things and then conclude that God exists based on a variety of premises having to do with morality or the universe and its design and so forth. Pascal's wager doesn't try to argue for the existence of God along any of these lines, and once I get it out here, you'll see how different it is. Pascal asked us to consider more or less just a bet, and the bet goes something like this. He says, look, we've got one shot at this life, and we can either live this life believing that God exists, or we can live this life believing that God doesn't exist. And so he says that when we should think about what the rational course of action is, rather than looking for some fancy argument for the existence of God, we should think about it like this. What if we're wrong in either of these scenarios? What's the cost to us? What's the risk we're taking? What's the bet we're making? If we believe that God exists in this life and we're wrong, then the worst thing that happens is we give up a finite amount of goods here that we might otherwise have been able to enjoy. We lose some time because we go to Sunday services, say. We don't behave certain ways that might have brought us a tremendous amount of benefit because we thought that God wouldn't want us to do that. So we do give up some finite amount of goods here, and that's the cost of being wrong. There's no God. We're not rewarded afterwards. If we believe that God exists and we're correct, then we get an infinite amount of rewards. So here's one side of things. We live a life believing that God exists. If we're wrong, what we end up losing is some finite amount of goods, some time, some benefits, and so forth. If we're right, we get an infinite amount of good things because we're in heaven, living eternally with fantastic life. The other side of it is, suppose we believe that God doesn't exist. If we're right about that, then the thing that we get to enjoy now is we get to enjoy more of our time, we get to enjoy more pleasures. But if we're wrong, if we believe that God doesn't exist and we got that wrong according to Pascal, then we face an infinite amount of suffering because we're going to end up in hell. What bet should I take? What's the rational course of action? Well, on the one hand, if I believe that God exists and I'm wrong, then I end up just with a finite amount of losses. On the other hand, if I believe that God doesn't exist and I'm wrong, I end up with an infinite amount of losses. Similarly, if I believe that God exists and I'm right, I get an infinite amount of goods. And if I believe that God doesn't exist and I'm right, I get a finite amount of goods. And when you weigh all these things together, and I'll just focus on the losses, it seems that the rational course of action is to take the bet on God. The downside of that is merely a finite amount of losses. The upside of it is an infinite amount of goods. When you do the reverse, taking the bet that God doesn't exist, the downside is an infinite amount of losses. The upside is a finite amount of goods. That's a bad bet. The rational person, according to Pascal, should take the bet that God exists. So I hope you can appreciate how different Pascal's reasoning is than some of the other arguments that we've looked at. Pascal is not trying to get us to conclude that God exists because of observations about the nature of the universe or about morality or about the concept of God. Pascal's saying, no, forget all that. Maybe you don't find any of that persuasive. Those arguments are notoriously difficult to assess in terms of their truth. Just think about this in terms of what's in your self-interest. What bet should you take? The bet you should take is that God exists. Well, it's a very, very clever argument. One criticism of it is just that it seems to be exactly the wrong way to think about how one ought to conclude that God exists. I mean, it's one thing to say, look, we want you to believe that God exists, supposing that you're a believer. Take a look at the universe. Take a look at how it's designed. Take a look at the concept of God. Take a look at morality. Don't you see how those things can lead you to believe in the existence of God, that there are explanations that only appealing to God can get you? That all seems within the realm of a reasonable way to arrive at belief in the existence of God. Pascal is saying, just think about what's in your self-interest. What bet would you take? Don't bet against the existence of God. It's a bad bet. You could suffer infinite losses and only enjoy finite gains. Do we really want people going around believing that God exists simply because it's a bad bet to believe that God doesn't exist? Well, Pascal's response to that is, who cares? What reason gets you at first to believe in the existence of God, so long as you're believing in the existence of God? Isn't that what really matters? Now, one might push back on Pascal and say, yeah, but your way of reasoning just tells me that, yeah, it's a bad bet to bet against the existence of God. Okay, even if I grant that, what am I supposed to do with that? I mean, how do I go from that to, like, going to Sunday services? I mean, is it just, fear or so forth? Pascal says, fake it until you make it. Seriously, he gives us reasons to believe that if you just sort of keep going through the motions, you realize it's a bad bet to bet against the existence of God, start going through the motions, and eventually you too will become a believer. Psychologically, he wasn't that far off. If we tell ourselves something long enough, we will start coming to believe it as true, even if we forget the origin of why we started telling ourselves that it was true in the first place. This is a common human tendency. All the same, I'm sure you can appreciate that some people think that this is exactly the wrong way to try to convince someone that God exists. On the one hand, it is eminently reasonable in that it appeals to bet making and what's in our self-interest. On the other hand, it seems to be missing something pretty important. Putting that concern aside, another criticism of Pascal is this seems to be a kind of a false dilemma. I mean, after all, it's not clear that God would punish you eternally simply if you didn't believe that God exists here on earth. That's a very Old Testament wrath of God sort of view of the way that God operates. I mean, if you live a perfectly good life, if you're charitable, if you're loving, if you don't lie, if you don't steal, but you don't believe that God exists, all right, maybe, depending on your theology, maybe you don't make it all the way into the most blissful existence. But it's a pretty stark view to think that you end up in hell for eternity, even if you did all those good things. This gets us into matters of theology that I'm just going to put it aside for a moment. The other concern is, what if the Hindu pantheon is the one that exists? What if the Buddhists are right? In other words, how do I make this bet once I enrichen the realm of possibilities about what might be true in other realms of existence? For Pascal, it's either God existing or God not existing, but isn't really the option God existing, God not existing, but the Hindu pantheon existing, and then we can keep going on and on and on. When we have all of those possibilities in front of us, how are we supposed to make this bet? A similar but different criticism is, suppose that you do believe that God exists for Pascal's reasons, and then you die and you go before God. Are we to really believe that God rewards you for an eternity of bliss because you believed in God as a matter of a safer bet? That seems suppose you lived a pretty terrible life besides that. I mean, again, that's not being entirely charitable to the view, but I hope you at least get the idea behind it. It strikes one that on any conception of God that we have, God wouldn't be too thrilled with people who came before the pearly gates believers simply because it was in their self-interest to be believers. Now, again, I've said that Pascal thinks that you fake it until you make it, you walk the walk, and eventually start talking the talk, so maybe he can get out of these things. Pascal's wager, famous argument, interesting argument, we're going to put it aside now, and that's going to end the portion of this module where we look at positive arguments for the existence of God. The ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the argument from design or teleological arguments, and then, of course, the moral argument and Pascal's argument. What a slew of arguments for the existence of God. Each one has some problems, some challenges. We've just looked at a few of those, but now we're going to look at things from the other side. Not starting first with an argument for the existence of God and then seeing if it has any problems, but starting first with an argument against the existence of God. In particular, the most famous argument against the existence of God, which can be found in the Old Testament with Job, and has certainly been a particularly popular way of reasoning throughout the ages. the problem of evil. How do we reconcile God's existence with the radical amounts of evil that we find here in the world?